Hi guys. I have my camera turned back on today. I'm sure most of you don't know, but I had COVID, and today is my first day back at the school. I worked from home, and so anyway, it's no joke. I can't taste, I can't smell. Um, so make sure you guys are staying safe and wearing your masks. Today we're going to talk about prokaryotes and eukaryotes. We kind of introduced the idea of prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells in the lesson earlier this week. So I want to talk a little bit more specifically about those because you really do need to understand the difference. So here are two pictures. The one on the left is a prokaryotic cell, and the one on the right is a eukaryotic cell. And we're going to explain each of these things. And we're going to talk more about um, like the different organelles later on in this chapter. But I just want to talk about a few specifics of the two. So first, let's talk about cell similarities. So all cells have a few things in common. With as different as what a eukaryotic cell and a prokaryotic cell are, there's still a few things that they have in common. So we talked earlier about how every cell has a cell membrane, right? So that's one thing that they have in common. They're surrounded by a barrier called a cell membrane or a plasma membrane. Both cells have DNA. Both types of cells have ribosomes, and both cells have cytoplasm. So we're going to talk more specifically about each of these. But here's the big thing that differentiates a eukaryotic cell and a prokaryotic cell. And this was one of the questions that y'all had to answer on your 7.1 assessment. Is there a nucleus or is there no nucleus? So the cells are placed in one of the two groups, in a prokaryotic or a eukaryotic group, based on whether or not they have a nucleus. So the nucleus, that's a large membrane enclosed structure that contains the cell's genetic material in the form of DNA. So it's what contains the DNA within the cell. A membrane is a thin layer of material that serves as a covering or lining. So basically, the nucleus has a membrane, that thin layer of material that serves as a cover or lining, and that nucleus holds the DNA. So the nucleus controls many of the cell's activities. So you'll hear the nucleus sometimes referred to as the brain of the cell because it controls many of the cell's activities, just like the brain controls many of our body's activities. So a eukaryotic cell, things that are eukaryotic or things that are referred to as eukaryotes have eukaryotic cells. So they are cells that contain nuclei. Eu means true, karyo means nucleus. So eukaryote literally means true nucleus. So you can automatically think eukaryote, there's a nucleus. Prokaryotes are cells that do not contain nuclei. So pro means before, karyo means nucleus. So prokaryote literally means before the nucleus. And so the word prokaryote reflects the idea that the prokaryotic cell evolved before the nuclei developed. So prokaryotes, they are 10 to 100 times smaller and simpler than eukaryotes. We talked a little bit about that already. They have the genetic material, but it's not contained in a nucleus. Instead, they have something called a nucleoid region. So in a prokaryote, there's no nucleus, so the DNA is just kind of floating around in that cytoplasm. These prokaryotes can only be made of one cell. So prokaryotes are unicellular organisms, and there are no membrane-bound organelles within a prokaryotic cell. So an example, there's only bacteria. Bacteria is the only type of prokaryotic cell. So if we're talking about bacteria, if we're observing bacteria, we're referring to a prokaryote or a prokaryotic cell. So here's a picture. So here we have the cell itself. And notice that there's this plasma membrane here. See the one on the inside. And there's a cell wall as well, but we're really not gonna focus on that right now. We're gonna talk about the fact that there's a cell membrane, right? Because that's what a prokaryote and a eukaryote have in common. So we have this cell membrane, and then we have the cytoplasm, which is just kind of the yellow material. It's what everything is suspended in. So notice here, this long squiggly thing, that is the DNA, and it's not enclosed in a nucleus like a eukaryote would. It's just floating in the cytoplasm. And this region that it's contained to is considered the nucleoid region. So it's not contained in a nucleus, but it's also not just everywhere in the cell, right? Like it is limited to this region, which is the nucleoid region, but it's not contained in a nucleus, which is the differentiating factor between a prokaryote and a eukaryote. These small dots, those are ribosomes, which we'll talk more about. But the big thing you need to know is that there is no nucleus. So here are some microscopic pictures of prokaryotes. All of these would be bacteria, but see how each one of these, they're just like a single-celled organism. Each individual ball or capsule or string, those are one single-celled organisms, and those are called prokaryotes. So now eukaryotes, which is a eukaryotic cell, they contain a nucleus which separates DNA from the rest of the cell. So with a prokaryote, right, we had the nucleus just floating in the cytoplasm. There was nothing separating that from the rest of the cell. Well, in a eukaryote, the DNA is contained within the nucleus. It's larger and more complex than a prokaryotic cell. It can be made of one cell or many cells. So a eukaryote can have one eukaryotic cell, or it can have multiple cells, whereas a prokaryote has one single prokaryotic cell. So a eukaryote contains membrane-bound organelles. Some examples are plants, animals, fungi, protists, pretty much everything but bacteria that's living is a eukaryotic cell. So when we talk about eukaryotic cells, and we will talk about the difference between plant and animal cells a little later, but look how complex these are in comparison to a prokaryotic cell. So notice, once again, this barrier is a plasma membrane, right? Now, a plant cell has a cell wall, but this inner membrane right here, that's a plasma membrane, just like this is. Okay. There's also the nucleus. See, this is the nucleus. This is a nucleus, and that is where the DNA is contained to. It's not floating around in the cytoplasm like it was in a prokaryotic cell. Now, like I said, we're going to talk more about ribosomes, but see, there's ribosomes found in eukaryotic cells as well, so that's a similarity. So we'll talk more about the difference between animal and plant cells, but eukaryotic cells and prokaryotic cells are what we're focusing on right now. And you can just simply look at a picture and see that a eukaryotic cell is more complex than what a prokaryotic cell would be. And the dead giveaway there is that eukaryotic cells have a nucleus and prokaryotic cells do not. But eukaryotic cells also have these membrane-bound organelles, and prokaryotic cells do not. So here are some examples. Okay, we have plants, we have animals, we have fungi, and we have protists. So each of these are made up of eukaryotic cells. So here's kind of like a little graphic organizer just to kind of summarize, to kind of show you the difference. So prokaryotes, eukaryotes, the meaning of prokaryotes literally means before nucleus. Eukaryotes means true nucleus. So that kind of answers the question, does it have a nucleus? Well, if prokaryotes means before nucleus, then no, it does not have a nucleus. And if eukaryote means true nucleus, then yes, it does. As far as size goes, prokaryotes are smaller. The location of the DNA, so we know the big difference between the two is a nucleus. So the DNA is found in the nucleus of a eukaryote, and it's in the nucleoid region floating in the cytoplasm in a prokaryote. Are there membrane-bound organelles? In a prokaryote, there are not. In a eukaryote, there are. And you can kind of get that question answered by whether or not there's a nucleus, right? If nucleus is a membrane-bound organelle and eukaryote has it and prokaryote doesn't, well then, no, prokaryotes aren't going to have membrane-bound organelles, but eukaryotes are. And then examples, only bacteria are prokaryotes, and then protists, fungi, plants, and animals are eukaryotes. So think, if it's complex, it's going to have the more complex cell. If it's less complex, it's going to have the less complex cell.